I still think it's helpful. Oh wait, I'm going to ask for another vote because we just talked about 21. We didn't talk about the rest of the document. But I think it's still helpful for everyone to see the language. I'd like to reintroduce it at the next board meeting just to make sure the language is...
Can I recommend we put it on the consent agenda? And so then if there's no concern with it, if it's just what we talked about, it should be able to pass through consent. And that way it'll be efficient.
Okay. So I think that's... Does that sound good to everyone?
Yes.
So then I'd like to ask for a vote on the rest of the document. So because we have several edits. So this is my first audible, so please let me know if I'm doing this right. So can we call for a voice vote on the rest of the document outside of 21?
Yes, so was the motion and the action just to strike 21?
To reword it.
To reword it? Maybe friendly after the fact motion and then to bring it back on the consent agenda reworded on February 23rd.
Yeah, I think the revised motion would be to pass off at 21 and to bring back 21 on the consent agenda at our next meeting.
Okay. Should we vote again?
We just repeal the first motion or vote it down, and then that's...
I might just, for sake of clarity, just ask you to revote with that understanding of
So-
what the amendment was.
So let's be clear. So the motion, as Ken summarized, is that we are voting to approve the document as it stands with the exception of item 21, which will be edited, and the completed document will be added to the consent agenda at the next meeting for final vote. Any seconds? Sandy seconds. All in favor?
Aye.
Didn't vote, Sandy. Aye. Aye. Passes unanimously. Thank you for patience with me for my first audible. And yes, so we'll get that on the consent agenda next time. Thank you, guys.
Now, the other part of that was the board decision-making matrix, which, can we pull that up just to, I think that's perhaps the second item. Oh, that's not the one I thought it was.
No, so the one you're thinking of, the flow chart,
Yes.
that's coming up in board communications.
Oh, it's a discussion. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, yeah, no problem.
But this is not a change from what we've had in the past. There's no red line.
This is a,
Thank you.
yeah, that has not been edited at all. So this. Based off our retreat, ideas of how to handle new business. All right, everyone. So we're good. We're going to move on to the next item, which is number 13, which is the second reading of board policies 8310, liability insurance, as of revised, 8320, property damage, which has deleted and combined with board policy 8310, and then 8350, privately owned property, which is reaffirmed. So this is the second reading of these policies. So is there a motion to approve?
So moved.
Second.
Okay. Any discussion, questions? Seeing none, I'd like to call for a vote. Great, and that item passes unanimously. Next action item is number 14, which is the developer extension agreement with the North Shore Utility District. And it is an action item, so is there a motion to approve?
So moved.
A second?
Second.
Okay. So any questions on this one? Fire hydrant near Arrowhead? No? Seeing none, call for a vote. And that item passes unanimously also. Next item is an information item, District Budget Status Report for December of 2015. Board members have any questions? Any items for discussion?
I have two items. One is a request for an estimated full accrual balance sheet. So that would be including the property, plant, and equipment, for which we don't have like clean audited numbers on that, but would be, there is an estimated number, and I talked with Jolie about that before, just to show that we could see a single column what the balance sheet is. And I think it's useful for the board to see that an estimated full accrual balance sheet, and it's going to be over $1 billion. And the balance sheet that we get is kind of at this fund level. And so most people who are used to seeing a company's balance sheet would be able to understand and see that. So it would just be all the funds totaled across, but it would also include our assets. Those are not audited, and I think the format that would be useful is to put just like an asterisk by the numbers that are not audited, which would be our property, plant, and equipment. And I just think from a transparency perspective, that would help us to see the entity as a whole. The full GAAP, just as a comment, the full GAAP, generally accepted accounting principles way of reporting, you do fund accounts. It's called dual track. There's two different sides of the book. So one's kind of this budgetary basis, which we follow, and which is the school manual, and that's fine. But then the full accrual, the GAAP basis, also includes the single kind of column entity-wide basis. And we don't do that, as most school districts don't. As we learned in the audit committee entrance, and as the audit entrance meeting, there's only 8 school districts in the state that follow full GAAP, but we are classified as a high-risk auditee for the federal audit because we don't do that. Now it's really a policy issue at the bean counters at the statewide level, the state auditor and OSPI. I believe we should follow full GAAP, and there's a path that it would take to do that. But in the interim, if we just had an estimated full balance sheet that included our property, plant, and equipment, and all the liabilities, I think it would be useful for the board to see that. And then my recommendation would be having it clearly being labeled unaudited, because we don't have our property, plant, and equipment audited, and then put an asterisk by the property, plant, and equipment, or any other line item that's not audited. So I think that would just be useful for transparency and to get a full picture of the financial position, the balance sheet of the organization.
So just, I'm curious about this, because I was at the audit entrance conference as well. Is it a big shift in how we structure our finances in general? I mean, is it a complex ask, I guess is what I'm asking, or is it something that we could tally? I'm trying to understand the scale of effort.
So currently, we have no system for our property, plant, and equipment. It would be valued at historical value or market value. We have neither. We have insurance replacement value. We do not depreciate our assets. So personally, I believe throwing our insurance replacement value would be misleading. In order to properly do that, we would probably need to hire a consultant to do a complete property, plant, and equipment review for market value and establish some sort of depreciation value, which could be time consuming and costly. So our insurance value is not insurance replacement value is not GAAP.
Ken, if you don't mind me asking, what do you feel is gained by that?
Well, I just think it's useful for the organization as a whole, as well as for a transparency perspective, to know, and if all we have, we can use whichever value that we have. And when GASB 34 was implemented, it was contentious. The asset piece was one of the most contentious, but it was mainly for infrastructure, things like streets, sidewalks, sewers. How do you put the number on that? The number that would go on a GAAP balance sheet for your property, plant, and equipment would be historical cost, which should be in the books and records what you paid for it. So like North Creek High School would be $120 million or whatever the final cost is, and then accrual accounting, you depreciate that over time. And so what's gained is having accrual accounting, or moving towards accrual accounting, to get a picture of the entity as a whole, which both us and the community don't have currently.
Do you have any concern that it might actually have the opposite effect of showing perhaps an unrealistic position of the district, because those are only assets that could be utilized in another way if there was an intent to perhaps sell them or leverage them somehow in either the operation or the ongoing support of the organization. I mean, I'm obviously I'm not in my area of expertise here, but I'm trying to see the other side of it, which is it could show an inflated figure that really represents nothing unless our intent would be to somehow leverage those assets to support our operation somehow. Most of them as the fixed assets, if they were sold, they could only be used on the capital side anyway.
Can't borrow against it. You wouldn't want, can't borrow against it.
No.
No, I mean, there's a small contingent of being able to issue non-voted debt as a school district, but you have to be able to identify a repayment source, and I don't think you could legally identify your assets as a repayment source.
Yeah, I was just asking if that would be one gain, but my assumption was, like I said, you can't do that in a public, within a public entity. Oh, I
Right.
have this asset
Yeah.
here, I'm gonna borrow against it, because you're not ever really gonna sell it.
I'm just trying to measure in my mind, what's the relative benefit? And on the one hand, I can understand getting a more complete picture of the overall entity and the overall value of the organization. But from the standpoint of our ongoing operations and our ongoing functions, I'm a little less convinced with my limited knowledge of this area that to me, I could make an argument that it perhaps further misrepresents the overall position of the organization. Again, unless we were somehow prepared or envisioning leveraging the property, the buildings, the fixed assets somehow to do something for us over time, whether it's to sell them or use those proceeds for some other purpose.
So I was thinking where this district budget status report that we get every month came from, and it came back, I think it was Todd Banks that asked for something, and it's been tweaked a number of times over the years.
balance sheet, right?
Yeah, well, the whole thing, we started getting it monthly, and it came back in the era of budget cuts because what was happening is both community and board were seeing a snapshot, particularly in October and April, and when all of a sudden we had a lot of money, and it was an attempt for us to understand the flow of the school year, and that's why we were getting it monthly.
Yeah, so that was, I think, a little bit different. Turn me on here, Cindy. So what Todd was primarily interested in was early in the year, so say in our cycle where we're at now, what was our projection of where our
Right.
ending fund balance was going to be at the end of the year?
Right, and that's where that
So-
last graph.
That last graph has always been the same. There was actually a separate documentation that we no longer provide now
Right.
that sort of projected out every month. And of course, that's what happens is it was fairly inaccurate early in the year, and then it got more accurate the closer we got to the end of the year. But I think it was the driver for him was wanting to know, perhaps in October or November, very early in the fiscal year, where we thought our ending position was going to be at the end of August.
Right, because we were desperate to find money wherever we could find it, so there was kind of this mentality of any chance we're going to go ahead by the end of the year.
I think it was I think particularly in the cutting
Yeah.
arena, it was an attempt to know, are we going to be in a position of having to make significant cuts come springtime based on where we think we're going to end up at the end of the fiscal year.
Right. So I guess my point is that this composition of how we did this came organically from requests from community and board as to what they needed to understand the process.
So, Ken, if I'm understanding it correctly, and again, this is not, if we were to look at, say, this sheet right here, and which shows our current cash balance is somewhere around $415 million in total across all 5 of our functions.
Actually, go up, I think. So this is the second half of the balance sheet, liabilities and fund balance.
Yeah, I'm just looking at the totals.
total.
So what you're suggesting would perhaps add $1 billion spread across those 5 funds, or, let's just say, if you used $1 billion, let's just say $1 billion for sake of argument, would add $1 billion to those totals spread across those 5 funds, most of them being probably in the capital and the general fund. Transportation vehicle, yes.
Yes.
Yes, value of the buses, I presume, would be categorized there. So it would add significantly to those balances there. And what I'm circling back to in my mind is, does that present a more accurate or a less accurate picture of sort of what is the position of the district? Because again, we have $3.2 million now in the transportation vehicle fund, using that as an example. That's hard cash we can use today to buy buses. If that fund all of a sudden says $10 million because we're adding, or $20 million because we're adding in the value of our current transportation fleet, that doesn't necessarily mean, you could look at that and say, oh, we have $20 million, we can go out and buy buses. John Q. Public might see it that way. That's really not the case, because that's reflecting the $3.2 million and the value of the fleet we already own. Am I capturing that sort of conceptually correctly?
You're absolutely capturing the parts of it, and the fund accounting, which these are, really is capturing that sense of what do you have to spend, and they use a spending focus.
Right.
And so that's what the GAAP allows you to do, and that's one valid purpose looking at financial statements. The other purpose, where you have these accrual basis, where you have the whole, all the assets, all the things, and then you look at the changes using GAAP to estimate depreciation expense or whatever. One of the things you get when you go to GAAP accounting is you find out in some sense kind of the change in net position. And one of the things you get at with your assets is some sense of whether or not you're funding your depreciation enough. Are you going forward, are you going backward? And there's other things that you're allowed to assess the overall financial condition. So the government-wide statements are not looking at this kind of budgetary spending focus, which is here, and it's a different focus. But it's generally accepted accounting principles. As an accountant, and I think as people who are used to seeing the government-wide perspective, that's what I'm asking. It's useful, I think, for people who do financial analysis. I think the district should look towards what would be the costs and issues from getting to full GAAP accounting. The question about what's the usefulness of it, it's useful to see the position as a whole for doing the financial statement analysis, but it's a simple request in my mind, and we do have the insurance numbers, and agree that those are insurance numbers. Those are not the GAAP numbers, which is your historical cost minus the depreciation. But I think it illuminates also to the board's attention. You've got $750 million worth of capital assets and inventory and other things, and that is a part of the financial position of the district, and there's a responsibility to understand, to control, to work with that. So,
I have a question. Do you know, Lydia or Larry or possibly Ken, is there a push in the state to have all school districts go towards GAAP? Because as Ken mentioned, and I'm not as familiar with this, though I used to do auditing, but not at this high level, that there's a push, or that there are 8 school districts have gone to GAAP, and now the auditors or the state is looking at districts that aren't on GAAP as high risk. Now, not high risk because we're doing anything different, but high risk essentially because we're not using GAAP, if I'm hearing you correctly. So is there this
Can I
transition?
clarify the single audit component? So under the single audit, starting next year, the auditors will be required, instead of auditing 25% of our federal awards, because we don't do GAAP, they'll have to audit 40%. So that's all that means for us, and it really doesn't change much. For instance, if they were to audit special ed IDEA, that's 50% of our total federal grants. So in that respect, it doesn't change anything. And currently, there isn't a push to go to GAAP. The push that we hear about periodically is actually to match levy revenue to levy expenditures, specifically state to state and federal to federal. So they're really interested in getting at the heart of what the levy is paying for, and I believe that's because of all the funding issues the state's having in the Cleary. So not a push towards gap, which won't reveal what the levy is being paid for, but a real small push towards you specifically identify those expenditures paid for out of levy by a different code.
Going to teachers or supplies, or that's what they're
Yeah,
asking.
right now, they just get commingled in general funds. and
Right, but they want to see
and they're
specifically how much is going to
Correct.
teachers, how much to supplies.
Some-
Actually, more, this is how much going to the teacher that's state funded, this is how much is going to their tri-compensation that's levy funded.
Yeah.
So more of a break in the accounting system to analyze that sort of data, that's
What are we supplementing?
what the legislature is trying to get at the heart of.
I can appreciate, again, Ken, not to repeat myself, I'm just trying to come back around and sort of run this in my mind as a non-financial person, which probably I would suspect I represent more the vast majority of our community as opposed to those who operate in the financial world, whether or not what you're proposing for those non-experts actually more misrepresents. What I think our community is more interested in is what funds do we have available to pay for things that continue the programs and the services that are most of interest and value to them. And my concern on the other side would be perhaps a little bit less transparency, that there would be a misrepresentation for the uninformed looking at inflated numbers that truly don't represent cash on hand to provide the programs and services that are most of interest and value. And I welcome comments of other board members.
It seems to me that the question really is about accrual accounting, the accrual accounting system, correct? Because, yes, so it seems to me that that is the question, and perhaps the question might be as if the board is interested in learning more about the differences between where we are now, moving towards accrual accounting would mean in terms of our systems, in terms of costs. You know, if you have to hire consultants or add headcount or whatever, that it seems to me that really kind of is the question I'm hearing.
I think you're correct. So I think that's like a future agenda item as we get down to that part of talking about and informing all of us about the cost. And then as Lydia brings out, this notion of being able to connect the cost to the program or the project or the object or the item. And one of the challenges in this state is because the state kind of sets your chart of accounts, they set your codes. So if you have kind of a way in which you want to think about things, you know, as an accountant, if you're in charge of your own books, you can do that. You can set in codes to keep track of that information. When someone else sets up your chart of accounts for you, your kind of regulatory accounting, some of those things can become more difficult to be able to code things in the way in which you want to pull the information out. So I think, and then also the notion of inventory control. So it's not just, the buildings are pretty easy. You could find out the cost of that, and you could throw in some estimated depreciation, but then there's all kinds of buildings, equipment, chairs, you know, the stuff that's in the chemistry labs, all the football equipment, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And one of the things we do see from people who follow GAP tends to be stronger internal controls and more advanced kind of thinking about their finances because they're doing GAP. You also have to do a more elongated list of disclosures and management discussions and analysis. So it is an investment, an increased investment in kind of that financial reporting, financial disclosure, and the time taken to do the reporting. And so I think it's a valid question to talk about. And being a very large district, you know, there's not a lot of billion-dollar enterprises that don't follow GAAP. And
Do we do, because I do get inventory control, do we do inventory control? Or do public entities in general engage?
So true inventory
Like
such as,
counting your merchandise, or you're not, we don't have merchandise, but.
well, we have a little bit of merchandise in the sense of like we have fuel inventory for the buses. Yes, we absolutely track that. And then what we have fixed assets. We have a fixed asset policy. We track all assets over $5,000, and that's ties with the federal regulations. We also track small and attractive assets, things like computers. But Ken is correct in that we have not tagged desks, chairs, certainly not pencils.
Lockable boxes, you know.
But even like student desks, the value of tracking, the cost of keeping them on your fixed asset and tracking them and doing periodic fixed asset inventory is costlier than the risk that a student desk will be stolen. So we certainly track what we consider theft sensitive.
Like copiers, or, I guess someone's not gonna haul out a copier, but things that would
5,000
be portable.
or small and attractive. Certainly a camera is small and attractive.
iPads or-
iPads are small and attractive. Student desks, not so much.
Right, and in
I mean, it's a real question.
It absolutely is.
Yeah.
Perhaps the request is that we do a little bit of thinking over the next several weeks and provide some kind of memo or white paper on the board from our perspective of what would be involved in a shift towards accrual counting, both from a labor intensity standpoint as well as perhaps some rough estimates, if we can, of what kinds of dollars, what kinds of staffing components we might be talking about. And then we could, at that point, have something maybe a bit more tangible to discuss about is there continued interest in furthering that conversation.
And I would add, if it's not too difficult to put on there, some of the things you said about what inventory we're tracking. So I know you said 5,000 and over, but there's probably things I'm not thinking of that you might track that.
Be helpful to me to visualize what the different statement would look like. I don't need it to be North Shore specific, but a sample, so that I can weigh if it will be valuable to me to have that additional information on a monthly basis.
That would be a question for me, actually, because I'm used to inventory control, really a true inventory tally being taken only annually. So I'm kind of curious in terms of the level of effort that would be required on a monthly basis, as in terms of, resources.
Count your inventory monthly, depending on what.
Sorry, I'm segueing very deep here.
Sorry.
Inventory, I see your point, you take annual inventories, but you also have invoices and use
Well,
reports.
that's true, that's true.
And this is like an accounting wonk fest. I'm just
Sorry.
really enjoying this. I apologize, maybe not everyone is. But the notion of having, but the question is like in having a report writer, when you have your system designed for managerial uses, which would be the other kind of a thing like, and I know I can see the wheel spinning. When you record transactions in a thoughtful way, then you can extract lots of information and intelligence out of them. But each time you code a different element, like whether it happened at the junior high or middle school or something like that, every single transaction that you code that way is a different effort. And so if you're coding 20,000 transactions a month, every little additional piece of information create some additional cost on that. And so it's definitely a cost trade-off question, and then seeing the information. I think they're exactly on the things. Let's think about what that would look like, and then what would be some of the advantages and disadvantages. And I love, Sandy, what you're saying. And what would we see? A lot of organizations won't necessarily do full accrual books or do all the adjusting entries each month. But if you got your system set up, like say with the invoice, everything else, it's already coded in there. You just hit the download button and it gives you the report there, but may not have all the appropriate adjustments, and so.
And losses, like, losses as far as like, are we losing computers? Are we losing tangible items? Do we have that in here? Because I was looking for that the other day, like.
Not on a balance sheet, but we do.
The auditor asked me that question, do I know about losses? And I'm like, what? Yeah.
We just get their check.
Did you
No,
have
they
a
asked if I-
second question on that?
Thank you, Lydia. The second question was on the budget for the capital projects fund. And I think it was the past budget, has us spending that down to the 24 million range. I'm just trying to go from memory here. Thank you. On the screen it's coming up. Yeah, 26 million. So this would be, I wish I had my pointer.
Debt service, I'm sorry.
Yeah, there it is, right there. 26,808 was the budget for capital projects fund. In the status update that we got from, in a board briefing, I think the 8th board briefing for January, it had the capital projects being spent down, but it was like to 50 or 60 million at the end of this year. They had that spreadsheet. So it's a two-piece question of the 26 million was the original budget. I don't think that was more, it been updated since that's probably a number that was passed in August.
I think the answer to that is that the encumbrances, the budget and the encumbrances cover projects that will take place over multiple fiscal years. So the 24 million is not, or the 26 million ending balance is really not necessarily so much a projected ending balance at the end of the 15-16 fiscal year, but the projected ending balance when the projects that are part of the budget for 15-16 wind themselves out, which will likely occur in 16-17, 17-18.
And then that document, I think, will be useful for budget discussion. I don't think it's at this, but that the capital projects fund had done a very nice schedule. It didn't have the exact projects by name, but it had the sense that that would be spent down, which was a question we had talked about earlier, and I think that was the very thoughtful. Yes, that was my second question. Thank you, Lydia.
Yeah, unfortunately, that's a project budget that by the state requires us to force into a one-year snapshot, which doesn't work very well, but.
Because projects go over multiple.
Yes.
Yeah, okay, thank you very much.
All right, any other questions on the monthly budget status report?
Thank you for your indulgences, colleagues. I appreciate that that takes time to try and make sense of it.
Absolutely. Okay, so next on the agenda is a first reading, a policy review. First reading of board policy number 3115, homeless students, enrollment rights and services. So this was a somewhat substantial edit. Anyone have questions or points of discussion?
They just changed this again, state legislature.
Pardon me?
Didn't they just change this again last week in the state legislature?
I'm not sure if there were any changes in the state legislature around homeless students.
Just did this again.
I think there are homeless students are encompassed in the new Every Student Succeeds Act reauthorization. There are provisions for homeless students in title.
That's where I read that.
So
Thank
there
you.
may be some changes in that legislation.
That is, I don't think it impacts it, but I feel like I'm just.
Homeless students are in North Shore.
Chris, we're a little under 200,
We have 167 right now.
167.
We always average around 200 every year. So
Is that a number that, I mean, are there some families that don't report homelessness that can go missed, or is
I'm
that?
sure we have a few families, usually high school kids don't like reporting that they are homeless. So we kind of find them through connection with counselors or maybe a teacher or whatever may contact me. Elementary kids don't have a problem. We know elementary kids, they are who they are. They just tell everyone what their situation is. And so we find them pretty easily. But the high school kids and junior high are really just hard to find. So I'm sure we don't catch them all. But we average around between 190 and 200 every year.
And the question I had, and I don't know that it belongs in this policy, but maybe it's just an information question, in terms of tracking those students, and they can move from school to school in various situations, but when we do a lot of our data on test performance and other things, you know, we have various indicators of students, English language learners, low income, free and reduced lunch, etc. Is there a tracking possibility for these students to see the effectiveness of our programs, especially like the community schools is what I think about, the meals that Sherry was talking about earlier in the PTSA's work on that, and I know there's always going to be privacy concerns. And so what's our ability to kind of keep track of a student who's homeless or, you know, as that's defined? And there's lots of ways that can be defined, I think.
Well, we haven't tracked them the way you're talking about, but I do know that it impedes social, emotional, and academic growth of homeless kids. I know it takes some, studies show it takes them around 4 to 6 months to catch up with their peers. Students that move around a lot compared to their students who have normal residency. But we haven't tracked them that way. I'm sure if that's something you're interested in, we can look into see if that's a possibility.
And then in terms of extended services for the hang time, junior high, whatever high school services we have, or for the elementary services, and if they have food insecurity, connecting to threads and treads and the other kinds of things, I'm just concerned of, how do we know that they're getting, as they're getting, so far behind because of those other factors that impede their likelihood of success.
Right, well, thanks to the North Shore Foundation, they give us a generous donation every year, about $1,000, and each family we give about $150. Each family that we dedicate towards buying clothing, and items they might need as the school year goes on. We also do things, especially with the senior class, those kids who are homeless the senior year, as far as buying their yearbooks, making sure they have even prom dresses. We do purchase those for young ladies, as well as bright young men's clothing also for those events. But we try to make sure they have a very positive senior year.
And are we limited as the district from doing that? And is that something that only the foundation can do, or?
We probably have to be a little bit careful of gifted public funds issues when it's coming to personal items like prom dresses or yearbooks or those kinds of things that really become the personal property of the student. So that's generally where we rely more on the grants and those kinds of things that are permissible for those purposes. I think at the state or the federal level, they do some, I have seen some reporting on sort of the academic progress and some of those other indicators for homeless students. I'm not sure what they may do at the state level. I need to look into that. At the building level or the district level, all of that information, even if the state aggregated it and reported it for us, would be masked, I would presume, because the N would be so small at any particular grade level. And so then the likelihood of personal identification increases, and usually there's a threshold of 10 to 15 or 30 students in a particular group before they report data.
And I guess lastly, just on this particular policy, what's the substantive effect of this policy in terms of how will we do business differently as a result of the revisions that are being made in this policy, if any?
Well, I think with the language in it, and this doesn't really apply to North Shore School District, but the first line talks about options will be made available to homeless families in the same terms as residents. In other words, look at Seattle School District. When they usually are remodeling the building, they move that whole student population outside the building. They put them somewhere else totally. We don't do that with modernized buildings. But that means that a homeless student that might be at that particular building has the right to follow that class.
In terms of the edits at the end, the superintendent will strongly encourage district staff to review the video on the OSPI website. Are they encourage district designated homeless student liaison to attend trainings? Are these any things that are a change to how we currently do things? Use a variety of communications each year to notify students about services available. At least the last bullet, it sounds like we're doing to the best of our ability as soon as we identify the students anyways.
Well, we just had our CPR evaluation, as you know, and we passed in all that area. So we're doing a pretty good job in identifying families. I do an annual training every year with the bus driver, transportation department, and maybe counselors and staff to where I feel it's needed at. I got to talk to those buildings about beginning of it.
This won't necessarily change
Doesn't change what we do.
what you're doing every day.
Right.
It's more of a compliance issue. We needed to make sure our policy ticked all the boxes of what it had to include.
Right. When the CPR, we actually we got to put things in early. This was one of the items that weren't listed in the policy, so it's just added.
Thank you very much, Dr. Thurbeck. All right, next item on the agenda. We're moving into board reports and communications. So the first item, this is a follow-up to our board retreat. So this is just documentation that I created based off of my notes. The first is the new business decision tree. So this is a summary of our conversations that, in a way of improving what we currently call our future agenda item requests. The idea to call it new business, and it was a challenge to document, but basically you start up in the upper right-hand corner in the blue box and go from there. So deciding whether or not it was urgent, and then kind of starting in a point that was made to having a default first step to start at, which it's hard to see in this. It's the highlighted gray box about the board director with the questions can ask for information. I just wanted to make sure this, A, correctly captured what we talked about, B, that's, you can follow it, hopefully you can follow it, and then see if it's something that we'd like to have as a reference or as we conduct our meetings, and then we would shift again from calling it future agenda request to a new business as the title of the item in our agenda, and we would use this framework to guide our discussions.
So we're not voting on this,
No, not necessarily. It's just more an introduction of it. So,
I think it's amazing. And I think through logic models and flowcharts like this, and I thought you captured exactly what we had talked about, and I mean, I think 99% of the time, we just follow this easily through. There might be that 1% of the time, or 0.5% of the time, you got to be that open, but in terms of capturing the way we intend to do business, and I think it's very efficient and effective, and allows us to both give the time needed for certain topics that could take 2, 3, 5 months, and as well as if there's something that's fairly quick and easy, we all get it, get information, we don't even need study session, we get, whatever, and we can act on things within about 2 board meetings. I think that's really, it's very responsive, I think, and so I'm very pleased with it.
And I wanted to ask, are you seeing this in, like, an example of today's agenda, number 17 or number 18, future agenda requests or future agenda items?
it would be number 18. So instead of future agenda items, it would be new business. That's what it would be called. That's the proposal.
Just need this flow chart right here. So,
Actually, Larry offered to laminate it for us.
thank you.
Put it right there. And this,
And then the nudge to go, oh, that's right.
And then he offered to put the working norms, which is a much shorter document, but the bullet points of, that we came up with in our, that would be on the other side.
And I think essentially what I'm understanding and what we talked about is we're just trying to find a more cohesive, structured way to bring things up. And
Right, and the idea that, again, as complicated subjects come up, as they will do in running a school district, how do we, in a consistent way, work them through some steps so that I think it can cut down on miscommunication, it can make sure we're being as thorough as some things might need, and just acknowledge that not every topic that comes up needs to be a future agenda item.
Right.
It's really a larger umbrella to put everything under.
That it points the way if we're going down a path and the answer is yes or no on a vote, and we have alternatives, so I think it's really clearly laid out.
And we actually followed it today when we were talking about our accrual accounting. Is it like, okay, yeah, let's do a board briefing on it. And I think it captures the way we want to work, so it's great.
So do we want to adopt it for next meeting? I mean, I don't know if we necessarily need a full motion because it's not a policy or anything like that, but if we want, we could maybe kick the tires next meeting. Give it a thumbs up. And it's always open, again, because it's not a formal policy, if we find it needs tweaking or editing as we go, yeah, for sure.
We could also include that or these 2 documents as well as part of the consent agenda approval of the revised item 21 for the board operating protocols. It seems like they sort of fit as addendums to the operating protocols to a certain extent.
the only question I have with that is I actually like letting us see how this works first. Let's do it for, I like it, but let's see how it kind of plays out, and then we can always add it, over the.
Okay, sounds good. So next meeting, we will have that item be called new business. We'll have these on the dais with us. We'll go from there.